stood at the entrance of the Grandview estate, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The wedding coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard and a politely puzzled smile, scanned her list once, then twice. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "Your name doesn't appear to be here." Over her shoulder, I saw my son, David, laughing with his friends, his tuxedo a sharp silhouette against the setting sun. When he finally noticed me, his smile didn't fade. It curdled into a smirk. He strode over, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said the words that would cleave my life in two. "Did you actually think you'd be welcome here? If you've ever felt that same shattering betrayal, if your story echoes mine in any way, then subscribe to this channel. You're not alone, and there are more stories of strength and survival to come. My name is Vivian. I am 68 years old, and in that moment, at the threshold of my only child's wedding, I understood that the boy I had raised had become a stranger, capable of breathtaking cruelty. The air left my lungs. The sounds of the string quartet and clinking champagne glasses faded into a dull roar. I looked into David's eyes, the same hazel eyes I'd watched light up on Christmas mornings and cloud with childhood fevers, and saw only icy dismissal. I could have crumbled. I could have screamed. Instead, a strange preternatural calm settled over me. I smoothed the front of the emerald green dress I'd bought for this very day, the one I'd imagined him seeing me in. "I see," I said, my voice eerily steady. "I understand perfectly. Have a beautiful life." I turned and walked away, my spine straight, each step taking me further from the life I had known. But as I reached the circular driveway, I didn't call for a taxi. I took out my phone, my fingers not trembling in the least, and dialed a number I had programmed for just such a cataclysm. "Anya," I said, when my lawyer and oldest friend answered. "It's time. Initiate the freedom protocol." There was a pause on the other end. "Viv, are you absolutely certain? Once I file these papers, there's no unringing this bell." "More certain than I've ever been about anything," I replied, my gaze fixed on the opulent venue receding behind me. "He just showed me my worth in his world. It's time to show him his true worth in mine. The story I'm about to tell isn't just one of betrayal. It's a story of secrets kept, of a fortune hidden, and of the ultimate price of disrespect. I had dedicated my existence to David. I found him, a scrawny, terrified 7-year-old, in an overcrowded group home when I was a 35-year-old widow, my own heart still raw from loss. His caseworker said he was difficult to place. I saw a child who needed an anchor. I gave him my name, my home, and every shred of love I had left to give. I was a high school librarian, a profession I loved but that paid a modest salary. David grew up in our comfortable but unassuming 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb. He saw me clip coupons, drive a used car, and fret over bills. He saw me work summer school to pay for his soccer league and his braces. What he never saw was the other half of my life, the one I kept locked away in a safety deposit box and managed through encrypted emails with Anya. My late husband, Michael, hadn't just been a beloved history teacher. He was a visionary. In the early 90s, he developed an obscure but revolutionary data compression algorithm. He sold it for what seemed like a modest sum at the time, but he retained the rights to its application in future, undeveloped technologies. He died in a car accident before he could see his true genius recognized, but that algorithm became the silent, beating heart of every major streaming service and cloud platform that followed. The royalties, managed by a discreet trust, and the fiercely loyal Anya, had grown into a fortune that could dwarf the GDP of a small nation. Our modest life had been a choice, a shield to protect David from the toxicity of unearned wealth, to make him value character over currency. It was the greatest miscalculation of my life. The poison entered our world in the form of Sloane. She was a marketing executive, all sharp angles and sharper ambitions, with a smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. David met her at a conference, and he was instantly smitten. At first, I was happy for him. He seemed buoyant in love. I invited them for dinners, prepared his favorite meals, tried to find common ground with her. But Sloane's disdain was a subtle, insidious thing. The first crack appeared over a pot roast. "David never told me you were so domestic," she'd said, swirling her wine. "It's charming in a retro kind of way." The word domestic sounded like an insult. David just chuckled. "Yeah, Mom's the best." Then came the comments about my house. "It's so cozy in here," she'd remark, her eyes scanning the well-worn furniture and family photos. "You've really made the most of such a compact space." The visits became shorter, the phone calls more rushed. "Mom, we're just really busy with work," David would say, his voice distant. "Sloane is juggling a huge campaign." The final descent began with the engagement. They announced it at a brunch at their sleek high-rise apartment. I was the last to arrive, finding Sloane's entire family already there, clinking mimosas. She flashed a diamond the size of a glacier. "Surprise!" they all chorused. I hugged David, my heart a confused mix of joy and unease. "Mom," he said later, pulling me aside. His tone was different, formal. "Sloane and I have been talking about the wedding. We want something really elegant, sophisticated. You know, a certain standard." I nodded, a knot tightening in my stomach. "Of course. I can't wait to help." But I was systematically frozen out. Sloane took sole charge of the planning. Every time I asked about the venue, the flowers, my role, I was met with a wall of pleasant vagueness. "We're still finalizing details, Vivian." "Don't you worry about a thing." 5 days before the wedding, my anxiety peaked. I hadn't received an invitation, but I assumed it was an oversight. I called David. "Mom," he said after a long, heavy silence, "about the wedding. Sloane and I have decided to keep it very, very intimate. Just immediate family and our closest inner circle." The knot in my stomach turned to ice. "David," I whispered, my voice trembling, "I am your immediate family." "I know," he replied, his tone flat. "But Sloane feels that you wouldn't quite fit the aesthetic we're going for. It's about the overall image. The overall image." Those 3 words echoed in the silence of my home for days. The woman who had read him Tolkien at night, who had held his head when he had the flu, who had sold her grandmother's pearls to pay for his college application fees, didn't fit his image. Yet I went. I told myself it was a test, that if I showed up, my presence alone would shatter the spell Sloane had cast. I was wrong. As I walked away from the Grandview estate, my phone buzzed. "Not David, Sloane. Your little stunt was pathetic. You have no shame. We're blocking your number. Stay out of our lives." I didn't reply. I went home, to the house where I'd raised him. I walked past the framed finger-painting masterpieces and the photos of graduations. I went straight to my bedroom closet, to a small fireproof safe hidden behind a panel. Inside, next to my passport, was a single black USB drive. I inserted it into my laptop. A folder opened filled with scanned documents. The one I opened now was a PDF, trust disbursement record, David's college tuition and living expenses. Total $186,230. Paid in full from the Michael Reed Trust. 09/15/2016. This was my proof, my first concrete anchor in the storm. He never knew his student loans were a fiction. That night, while David and Sloane celebrated their union, I began my dissolution. I emailed Anya the authorization codes. I logged into banking portals I hadn't touched in years. The modest numbers in my checking account were a decoy. The real assets were in a labyrinth of trusts and offshore holdings. By dawn, the financial infrastructure that had silently supported David's entire adult life was being systematically dismantled. The first call came 3 days later from a resort in Bali. It was David, his voice breezy, sun-soaked. "Hey Mom, listen, we're extended our trip for a few days. Can you go by the apartment and water the orchids? And Sloane wants you to make sure the cleaning service did a good job on the master bath. She has very specific standards." I took a slow breath. "No, I can't." "What do you mean you can't? It's not a big deal." "I'm busy," I said simply. "You'll have to find someone else." I hung up. The phone rang again instantly. This time it was Sloane, her voice a shard of glass. "What is wrong with you?" "We're on our honeymoon. This is the least you could do after embarrassing us. David is furious." "I didn't embarrass you," I said, my voice calm. "I simply came to witness my son's marriage." "You embarrassed yourselves. He doesn't want you there," she screamed. "You're a millstone around his neck." "An obligation." "An obligation." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. "You're right, Sloane," I said, the calm in my voice now forged from steel. "I am an obligation, so I'm relieving him of it. Effective immediately, David no longer has a mother." I hung up and powered off the phone. The next morning, I hired a moving company. I packed my personal treasures, my books, Michael's letters, a few pieces of art, and donated or sold everything else. I sold the house within a week for cash to a lovely young family. I moved into the penthouse suite of the Pennington, the city's most exclusive hotel, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to decide my next move from a position of absolute power and comfort. Anya visited me there, her briefcase full of documents. "Vivian, the deed to their apartment, the one in that glossy high-rise, it's in your name. You bought it outright for $1.8 million. The mortgage David brags about paying is a direct debit from an account you've been funding. His job at that prestigious ad agency? The founder owes his first major client to Michael's patent. David's rapid promotion was orchestrated." I took the papers. "Then it's time he learned what it means to stand on his own 2 feet. The problems began for them as soon as they returned from paradise. First, the electricity was cut off. David called, sputtering with rage. "Mom, the power company shut us off." "Why didn't you pay the bill?" "Because it's not my apartment," I replied. "And I am no longer your mother. Don't be ridiculous." "Of course you are. Mothers are invited to their sons' weddings," I said. "I was not. The transaction is complete." "It was just a wedding," he shouted. "Precisely," I whispered. "Just a wedding. And you decided I had no place in it." Next, Sloane's coveted platinum credit card, the one that funded her personal shopping sprees at Bergdorf's, was declined. The card was on an account I had opened and paid for since the day they moved in together. The fallout was immediate and vicious. David called me, his voice a weapon. "How could you be so petty? Sloane needs that card. You're a bitter, lonely old woman." The words stung, but they also solidified my resolve. "David, for 30 years, I swallowed my pride so you could have everything. You treated me like garbage at the most important moment of your life. Now you get to learn what that life actually costs." I hung up and dialed the number for Julian Croft, the CEO of David's agency. "Julian, it's Vivian Reed. I believe it's time we discussed my son's performance without my family's." Historical influence, Julian's voice was grave. "Vivian, I've been expecting this call. Without your patronage, I'm afraid David is unemployable here. His work is subpar, his attitude entitled. Several clients have refused to work with him." "Then treat him as you would any other unemployable employee," I said. My next move was a visit to his office. I arrived in a chauffeured Rolls-Royce, wearing a custom-tailored Carolina Herrera suit. The receptionist gaped. David emerged from his cubicle, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk. In private." In the conference room, I laid it out. "David, your job, this career you're so proud of, has existed for one reason only: my family's money and influence. That ends today." "You're lying," he stammered. I called Julian Croft on speakerphone. He entered the room, a file in his hand. "David," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth, "these are your performance reviews for the last 2 years. Chronic lateness, missed deadlines, a client loss totaling over $500,000 in revenue that your mother personally covered. You have 2 weeks to secure alternative employment." David crumpled into a chair, his face ashen. "Mom, please, you can't do this. Sloane will leave me." "You should have thought of that before you exiled me from your wedding," I said, standing to leave. "You are about to learn the value of what you so carelessly discarded." That night their world imploded. David returned home shattered. Sloane, waiting with a glass of champagne, took one look at him and knew. "What did that witch do now?" she demanded. when he told her her horror wasn't for him, but for her own reflected glory. "You're telling me your mother got you that job? That you're a fraud?" Their argument escalated into a screaming match so violent the neighbors called the police. The officers found Sloan hurling a vase against a wall while David wept on the floor. Meanwhile, I decided it was time Sloan learned who she was really dealing with. I dressed in my most understatedly expensive outfit and visited the high-end boutique where she worked part-time to fuel her addiction to luxury. She was folding a cashmere sweater when she saw me, her face contorted with pure hatred. "What are you doing here?" "Slumming." "I'm here to shop," I said pleasantly. "I'd like to see that vintage Chanel jacket in the window." "The one priced at $8,500, she scoffed. "You can't afford that." I handed her my black American Express Centurion card. "Try it." She swiped the card, and the terminal beeped its approval. The screen displayed a credit limit that made her jaw go slack. "How?" she whispered. "I'm not poor, Sloan. I never was." I showed her the balance of one of my smaller investment accounts on my phone. The number had 8 digits. She stared, her face draining of all color. "I wanted David to love me for me. But you both showed me my only value was transactional. So now we will transact. The apartment is mine. David's job is gone. The life you know is over." I left her standing there, a statue of stunned avarice. The revelation triggered their final fatal spiral. Sloan took to social media, crafting a narrative where she was the blameless victim of my psychotic jealousy. Her post went viral, painting me as a monstrous, wealthy hag, destroying her son's happiness. It was my final test. I could have let it lie, but I was done being silent. I created an account and told my story, not with vitriol, but with devastating facts. I posted the tuition receipt, the property deed, the records of the monthly gifts to their joint account that paid their rent. And then I played the recording. I had started recording our conversations after the first subtle insult from Sloan, for my own protection. The audio clip I uploaded was crystal clear. Sloan's voice, shrill and venomous. "You are a burden, Vivian. A sad, lonely burden. David doesn't need you. I am his family now." The internet, fickle as ever, turned on a dime. The hashtag Team Vivian began trending. Sloan was fired from the boutique for bringing negative attention. David was formally terminated. The eviction notice arrived at their door, giving them 30 days to vacate my property. Their desperate attempts to contact me, to negotiate, to apologize, were met with a wall of silence from Anya. They were pariahs, financially and socially bankrupt. The marriage, built on a foundation of superficiality and entitlement, collapsed under the weight of reality. Sloan left him within months, her own reputation in tatters. 6 months later, I am writing this from a sun-drenched villa in Santorini. I bought it on a whim. The silence here is not lonely. It is peaceful. The money I reclaimed from David's failed life I have since used to start a foundation for aging women in crisis, offering them legal and financial resources to escape abusive situations. I have found a purpose that is entirely my own. I received one final letter from David, forwarded by Anya. It was full of regret, of realization, of pleas for forgiveness. He and Sloan are divorced. He is working a manual labor job, living in a studio apartment, and finally, truly, understanding the magnitude of his loss. I did not respond. Some doors, once closed, must remain shut for your own survival. I loved the boy he was with every fiber of my being. I do not regret a single sacrifice I made for that child. But the man he became made his choices, and I have finally made mine. My story is one of countless others. If you have a story of setting yourself free, I hope you'll share it in the comments below. You are not alone, and if this tale of finding strength in the aftermath of betrayal resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. There are more voices here that need to be heard, and more stories of reclamation waiting to be told. Your own piece might be the next chapter you write.